One that I think really comes to mind is when you're drawing this mannequin, like when you're starting with, like a head, one question would be like, do you work your way down? Like, do you draw a head and then do you start drawing like, the figure and kind of like building it out from there? And I think my reaction is that that's doable, especially if you're drawing like the figure again, like doing something. If the figure is like, let's say, bending over, you can kind of like foreshortened. Here's like the scapula. Here's like the arms. So it's like, would you kind of work your way, top to bottom down? And my thought again, as always, with stuff like that would be like, yeah, you could definitely do that. But something I feel like I realize more and more is I think this is really natural once you've drawn it a lot. Like once you've drawn this figure a lot, and you can kind of instinctually or naturally nail the proportion of the figure for the most part. I think it works better in this method, but in the beginning, I feel like it is really important to like draw that line, like to have like some kind of line of action or some kind of line that touches the ground, so that right away you can start to kind of like carve that line up versus like working your way down. So what I found like when I was doing the mannequin is a lot of times I would draw the head and then I would draw a line, I'd hit it down here, especially with like a little mark, especially if I was doing like that standing model, that basic one. And then from the top of the head to the bottom of that line, that's where I try to find about halfway. And then from there, that's where I start to build the figure. So I'd say, okay, well, here's the ribs, here's the pelvis, the legs. So again, from like here, halfway on the whole figure to the ground, about halfway of that is the bottom of the knee. So usually I put a little kneecap. And I'm going to draw this a couple of times because I kind of want to walk through some different ideas like as I'm drawing it. Straighten that out just a little bit. And then, of course, in the very basic first stages, you could just draw, this idea, like just the arms kind of off to the side, not really including like the scapula or the shoulder blade. But yeah, the point being that I think in general as a beginner, and again, even for myself, having drawn the figure a lot and kind of naturally, a lot of times naturally feeling that proportion, I still like to get like this down, like a line at the very beginning, so I can kind of gently or kind of like sort of subtly carve that up, have something to actually look at. So here it is again. So usually I draw the head. You could draw a line. This is really technical. Like if you just want to draw a line of any size, right, any scale, top to bottom, then cut that in half. And even in the book, I think Loomis stresses a lot to not be mathematical. Like again, don't get like a ruler, don't do anything like that. Do your best to actually use sight size or kind of like use your eyes to sort of get that half. But yeah, do that, draw the half. If you cut the top in half and then one more time, that gives you your head unit. So this of course would be your head. I'm going to do kind of like the Loomis where it's just an egg. And then down here, from halfway on the body to the feet, cut that in half, and that's going to be at the bottom of the knee. And so then, from here, if you're using like the head units, you could go like each head unit down to all those specific landmarks. What I do personally a lot of times, what I do personally a lot of times is, for better, for worse, this is part of the approach, right, is to kind of just be sometimes general, don't be too specific, but for better, for worse, I would say just drop a little bit lower than the head, and that's usually where I'd stick the shoulders. And then something that I actually learned from Will Weston, which this is where it's cool to like blend different kinds of life drawing theory. Something I learned in his class was from the collarbone, the clavicle, from the collarbone all the way down to the crotch, the pelvic floor, the halfway. If you cut that in half, if you take that and make a little box, and then you cut that in half, you'll basically have the ribs in the top half, and then the pelvis in the lower half. And you could argue that this is even like half of the half, right? Like a quarter of that box. So that's something I sometimes blend into the mannequin when I'm drawing as well, is that torso being divided in half and like where those landmarks are. And then again, same thing here. So from the crotch to the bottom, we would cut that in half. That's where the kneecaps are. or the bottom of the knee, excuse me. So I usually put the kneecap there. So now I'll put like a little kneecap. Come down further. And then this is, I think it's in the book in particular, but this is kind of like my symbol for like really fast feet. And what it's showing in more detail would be like this. Like here's like your ankles, here's your instep, here are your toes, here's your big toe, going back into like your heel. So it's like a triangle, even in its more detailed form, but that's kind of like what the shorthand looks like when it's more extrapolated like into like an actual look. So yeah, then on the top here, you know, again, the one idea is you don't want to draw the arm coming off like this because it's a socket, it's like a ball and socket. So the arm's actually kind of like floating off the ribs when you think about it. So it kind of floats here. It comes down to the belly button. That's one of those cool landmarks that of course comes from Loomis. And then wherever you have that halfway point, which is a couple of things, right? The halfway point is the bottom of the pelvis, we call it pelvic floor. It's where you have, this is a very specific word you don't need to know right now, but that's called the great trochanter. That's like the top of the femur. And then also that coincides with the wrist, like that's where your wrist would start. So your wrist would start here, and then you have your hand. And your hand is ideally reaching about the middle of your thigh. This is something I talk about in, I think like the week 3 or week 2 post. That's surprising or not surprisingly, let me find one fast. There's actually quite a few drawings in this book that aren't like perfect. You know, meaning like the arms are kind of like too long, or they might be like a little bit short, but they tend to be like really long. Like sometimes he's drawing stuff in here that feels really long, like longer than halfway. You know, on certain pages, like I know I have a little mini camera right now, but on stuff like the bulk frame, some stuff generally is like longer than it should be. And that's cool in my opinion. I think I wrote that because it just shows like, hey, it's okay. Like this stuff is one, not always gonna be perfect. 2, these are like, these are canon or like laws of the body. But then like if you go a little under or a little over, like it's gonna look fine. And even people tend to sometimes fall into that, right? Especially with stuff like arms, like wingspan, things like that. But yeah, that said, the hands ideally hit about halfway on the thigh, which just goes to show too, like how long that kind of like wrist and palm and finger idea can be. So, you know, it's like your wrist, of course, starts like here, wrist, palm, fingers, like that's quite a bit of length, you know, coming off the arm. So that's why starting from the halfway point all the way to halfway on your thigh, like that whole thing is your hand as like a unit, right? It's kind of like this. So again, I'm going to draw, I think like a couple times over and over this mannequin to kind of show one, things I'm thinking about, ways to construct it, and then also to of course stress, this is really great practice. Like the book itself, you know, again in chapter 1, I believe it's page, I'm not going to pretend like again I'm a guru like on page 34, but I remember it's, oh yeah, here we go. Actually, it's page 43. I just got it inverted. I'm dyslexic. I just got there. But yeah, on page 43, he talks a lot about how, you know, understanding this mannequin and drawing it is truly the first stage, like before the muscle, before the bone, before like more detail, like just get familiar with this, just draw this like over and over and over again. I, in a lot of my classes, even in classes like the character design class, like the Michelle's in, I would call this like an essential skill. Like, you know, I should stop you on the street and hand you a piece of paper and say, hey, draw a figure that's standing straight up proportional, right? You know, frontal view or whatever. It's like it's a most basic core skill that we should all be able to do, I think, especially to build on it. So that repetition is important. That's why we draw it over and over again. So again, here's how it kind of looks as a form. So I tend to draw the head, then I'll draw a line. How long do I know that line's going to be? Again, part of that is that practice, that kind of instinct. If you don't quite feel that, let me take this little picture out of the way. If you don't quite feel that, then I would say start a lot of times just drawing a line. Because no matter how long you make the line, cut it in half, you know, start dividing it up, and you can make any proportional figure, right? So if you feel like this gets hard to like judge, like drawing a head and then a line, just draw like a line in general. And then the first thing you immediately do is cut it in half, try to cut it in half. So same thing here. We imagine from the top of the head down to the feet, about about halfway on that. I'm doing this on the screen because I think it shows up a little bit better. But just so you know, if I was doing it on paper, like I'll even ghost and kind of like imagine like halfway. So I don't always just like eyeball it. Like I'll even try to like gently imagine like what 2 lines would look like what that halfway is. So top to bottom, about halfway. You know, again, the more, speaking of that, the more natural you get, you can kind of draw your torso on there. But again, the hybrid, the thing that I tend to blend in with Loomis is drawing like a little bit of like a shoulder, like a collarbone idea. And then imagining from that point to the crotch, the halfway point, you know, that about half on that would be the rib cage. So again, this is building a little bit on the head model, like on the head stuff that Loomis talks about. This is like some different kind of measuring strategies like the other people use. And then of course from that rib to about the crotch, about halfway in that, this is pretty rough, but about half of that would be your pelvis. It's about halfway between the rib and that halfway point on the body right there. We've done this over and over again where we flare the leg bone out because that's what it does. So the femur, you know, looks like this. It has a ball. Actually has kind of like this little flat part. Again, that's the great trochanter, pardon me. And then it comes down and then kind of ends like a box or a block. And then you have your kneecap. And then of course you have your other leg bones down here. But the very important thing would be this, that it genuinely like bows out and then goes back inside to the knee. An error, like a thing that can be tricky for students I talk about is like, don't do this. Try not to like shoot those legs straight down from the pelvis. Try to avoid that course because it's not correct. And then it also just leads to behavior that doesn't make sense because then the legs are like too close. There's like no spacing in them. So you always want to imagine again that kind of like flare out. It comes out of the pelvis and then comes back in. So it comes out of the pelvis, comes back in a little bit. Where does it stop? We say from the crotch to the end of the ground, about halfway on there. That's what they call the bottom of the knee. So, and I had to look this up quite a bit because like most things, especially with this idea, I pursue like the big answer, like the ultimate answer, like, okay, what do they consider the bottom of the knee? Like, what do they mean? And a lot of times it's considered this. This is considered like the bottom of the knee or the bottom of like what's sometimes called the knee box. So it's actually going into the second bone on the bottom of the leg, like going down there, but it's kind of like this. It's like the bottom of what we call this whole box. So then usually where it says bottom of the knee, that's how I know that kneecap's like a little bit higher, just a little bit higher than that space. Then you come down with your lower leg bones. There's 2 bones in your lower leg, but of course right now we're simplifying it as 1. Do that. And again, the triangle like this that kind of flares out, that's a good like simple symbol for feet that are facing forward. And again, just to show you one more time how that looks, this is like the actual anatomy. You'd see your ankles, you'd see like your instep, you have your big toe going into your heel, and then your other toes. So that's why, and I'll draw it in red, that's why we kind of shorthand it like this. It's like a little triangle shape. Now, the book, and then in general, the mannequin is like built up a little bit. They kind of like add more and more to it, right? So maybe I'm gonna make this head just a little bit bigger. So they add more and more to it. So one thing that I love to like always put on there is this, is the shoulder blade. And Loomis has an analogy or like a symbol that's really cool that I think lots of people still use contemporary, like, you know, in terms of like contemporary instruction, like I've heard people talk about this, which is what's called kind of like a cape. And so the idea is that you have these 2 pieces coming off, these are like your shoulder blades, that's already starting kind of the look of a cape. And then you would do this, you kind of fold it over the front to give you the pectoral. So again, kind of like almost like folding the cape over your chest or over your body, that's what gives you that pectoral shape. And then further that's what gives us this. So then now we have this little piece right here, this little socket that we can put our arm bone in. So put the little arm bone in there. And again, at about halfway near that bottom of the pelvis, that's where our wrist would come in. And our hands. So zoom out a bit. So again, I'm getting kind of prepared now to draw the same shape. I'm gonna like stack some of the extra stuff on there. Because again, this is like the basic one. In fact, of course, we definitely want to stress that the one right here is like the most basic. And as helpful as it is, like, or as it should be, you know, stay there when you're gesture drawing, or when you're drawing figures, or when you're practicing these proportions. Stay there as long as you like, return to that even. Meaning, you know, if you even end up drawing, I'll draw it small here, figures like this, just like a head, a circle, another little circle, you know, little legs, and little arms. You know, for a lot of people that have had my classes, you know, in the past, or like kind of work with me, I always say, hey, that's a victory right there. Like, that's a way better figure. That's a way more expressive, kind of like truly realistic figure, even in that stick form. So meaning like, you know, you even took like your stick figure now and evolved it into something like this. That's just as valid and important as, you know, like stacking all this detail on there, like starting to get more and more detail. So hang out in this first stage for a while. But that's it. I'll build now like kind of a, not only a more fleshed out one, but this is one that I've drawn a couple of times, even on these pages that I've been posting, where it's like, this is where I start to kind of enter with like my figure, like how mine looks. Up here's, let's see, Jim, we got some of those coming in. Yeah, and real quick, because we're doing okay on time, I have about like 15 more minutes. Does anybody have any questions or any like thoughts on drawing stuff like this, even like experience with it? I know, of course, since I've worked with a couple of you, I know that you have some experience with this. Any questions so far? Anything that's needs some clarification? Questions, Kate? Just okay. So now I'm going to take again the same mannequin, but I'm going to build one, or build it in a way that I tend to build, which is still again very faithful to a lot of stuff in Loomis, like a lot of stuff we're even discussing in the theme of like this whole book. But this is like how I kind of build it, like little extra things I tend to put on there. Okay, so again, we'll have our head. In fact, let me start it my way, because what I start, of course, is with the ball and jaw. So I'll actually start with the cranium or the ball, and then I'll put the little jaw in there. So super, of course, important to me. I always call that, I think I've said it even in front of Michelle a couple of times, I call it tombstone wisdom. It's like the thing that you'll stick on my tombstone. And that's one of them, is ball and jaw, right? How many times do I say ball and jaw over and over again? And it's important again, because it's the pieces, right? Especially from the side. You know, that's the actual pieces of the head. And so it's very important to start, you know, as early as possible, always building like that, build that ball and jaw. So yeah, first I do ball and jaw. Then I'm gonna go ahead and draw this one a little bit more, again, like my way, where I kind of draw just going down. So then I'll draw the ribs, the pelvis. To actually avoid math, you know, we'll say things like, again, this is not like that big of a space. Like, there's actually not a lot of spacing between the ribs and the pelvis, especially from like the peak of the pelvis, like kind of the peak of the rib. So all that to say, like, those are, in my opinion, important tips too. Like, don't worry about like measuring it. Don't worry about some specific spacing, but just know, like, again, those things are a lot closer than you might think. And then to kind of finish the gesture before I start to flesh it out. So this is a lot of times what I would do is I would draw like this, you know, then I would kind of like ghost it, but I'll draw it physically on here. You know, then I would usually do something like this. I'd say, well, if this is about that much, that's about that much. You know, that's exactly the way I'd say it in my head. I'd be like, well, if the top's about this much, then I should have about that much for the bottom. So like right away, I'll kind of give myself that estimate of where everything's going, you know, like about there. So then, I'll leave it on there. That way you can kind of see that. I was toned down a little bit. So yeah, so then I'd usually say, okay, that's about where the figure ends. Here's about halfway between those spaces between the crotch. Again, the crotch, AKA the pelvic floor. So from there to the ground, about halfway is where the bottom of the knee is. So then I'll draw, just like Loomis, again, I start a lot of stuff like this where I'll kind of draw it like the Loomis stuff, and then finish off with a little symbol for now. And then up here, I'll usually start the cape, which tells me where those arms will go. Okay, and then I'm just gonna move this down a little bit to put it in line. Okay, now what I tend to build on this one, like some stuff that I start stacking onto this would be, so the first thing I tend to do is actually, I love, I do this a lot, especially when I'm drawing like these kind of diagrams. I love drawing first this. So this is like the neck connecting into what's called the jugular notch, which is actually a really important landmark. So of course, as the name implies, it's like a notch, like you can literally like touch it or like push into it. And then these big ropes on your neck that connect behind your ear, they connect into that. And so that's actually like a big, important junction and like an important point for like where your neck connects. And then also that's where your collarbone comes out. And it's where like your sternum comes out. So it's kind of like this nice landmark. And what I especially like to do is, I like to use that, I'll try to draw this really small. I like to think about that like if I was drawing someone like 3/4, like someone turning or whatever, you know, that's basically like my little axis. Like that's my little thing that's like pointing in 3D, telling me like how that figure is oriented. So I use that a lot, this little junction. And again, I'll put it in red here. And this is again what's called the jugular notch. We're actually, I think in the last post of the month on Patreon, we're actually going to talk about that because this is where we start to talk about like landmarks, like bony landmarks in the body. So that's one of them. So yeah, I usually draw that. And then I build on it because I show like that collarbone. And then that also gives me the neck, like if I wanted to connect the neck on there, which that's called the trapezius, right? So again, this is like a little bit of the extra stuff I build on the figure. Then I usually put the rib cage, you know, put like a little symbol like that. Sometimes, okay, this is all just a little extra stuff I like to stack. Sometimes I like to truly show like some form in it, like a little wrap in it. Here's that cape coming over. It's a wonderful, again, analogy, something that's, you know, like probably 50 or 60 years old that he said, and I still see a lot of people talk about it, and I love it. It's like one of my favorite analogies is the cape. It goes over the front to give you those pectoral. While we were sitting here kind of just spitting facts from the jugular notch, if you go about 45 degrees, like exactly from that, that's where you'll get the nipple. So they're like, there's a pretty good like axis between that center, that jugular notch, and where the nipple would go. Now to keep this kind of in the mannequin world, I'm still gonna do just like the bones of the arm. I won't really draw like muscle and stuff. But to like build on that, what I would do is I'd usually draw now an arm that actually has like some depth, like actual like sides. And then just like the knee, there's actually a lot of similar kind of behavior and shape. Just like the knee, it actually ends as kind of like a little box. So it's kind of ended like a little flat like that. And then this ends near our belly button. So if we were to wrap in 3D, like dot, 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 kind of in 3D, it should end at about our belly button right there. A little bit specific to the male model, just because women will hold the belly button or it's a little bit lower anatomically. So of course, like the Loomis book, a lot of stuff is geared towards men. There's slight changes between male and female. That stuff's going to come up soon in the book. And then that'll be really cool because we'll get to, in theory, we'll get to draw that. We'll kind of draw and discuss like some comparing and contrasting with the two. But yeah, otherwise the elbow to the belly button works for the most part, but it's kind of specifically on the male figure. So I draw that, and then kind of like I would do with the knee, I'll draw like another little like top box, like connecting into it. And then draw down towards that halfway point, because that's where the wrist is going to go. This is how they try to get you. I'll show you real fast. Zoom's like, hey, a gift from Zoom. We've removed the 40-minute time limit on your group meeting. Hooray! So it'll go like just a minute or two over. That's how they get you, though. They're nice to you until they sucker you into that membership, which I will get again, because I want to start doing some workshops and classes, and so we'll get that time limit completely released. But thank you, Father Zoom. Now at the halfway point, again, that's where the wrist starts. I wouldn't worry too much right now at this stage if you're doing some beginner stuff on like angle, you know, but it is kind of nice to like cut this a little bit like that, like at an angle. It's kind of like the ankle, which we'll show in a second. You know, like instead of just always cutting things like straight up and down or straight side to side, really get comfortable with like thinking about how things are a lot of times in kind of more at an angle. Even like how I see right here, like I kind of stress like a little angle there. I could probably stress a little bit more there. And then the symbol or like the language I use for a hand is, of course, I usually just do like a thumb kind of going down into the fingers. The hand is very much this staircase, like this stair step. So meaning like if you have your arm with like your wrist, then like your palm kind of goes down a little bit. And then even like your fingers go down a little bit like that. So anatomically, you have this, boom, boom, boom. You have like a little staircase. And of course, that's one of those things, again, we can just look at ourselves. We can like look at our, you gotta watch out for it. Don't point that any higher than 45 degrees or you're gonna end up in trouble, right? So point that flat, look at your arm, and again, see that shelf, that kind of like staircase or shelving that happens. And so that's why it's subtle, you know, but when you're drawing that hand, try to keep this flat and then like even like point it kind of like in, like have it again kind of stair step. So here's the leg bone, just like on the top, giving it like a little bit of depth, like so mean like a little bit of shape. And then here's our kneecap. And then still for the most part, again, because this is like a mannequin, like I'm not going to put what's called our fibula. That's like our small little leg bone right there that actually makes part of our ankle. But since this is a mannequin, like we kind of avoid anything too fine like that. So then I would still just kind of jump, or excuse me, I'd kind of lump all this together like that. Down here, if you want to get kind of really cool with this, you put the inside ankle high and the outside kind of low. So you end up with a little angle like that. And this is one of my favorite tips, which possibly is in the Loomis book. I know I've seen this for like a long time, which is when you have your legs, let's say here's your knee. So this is actually like the skin look to your knee. So you have like your, what's called your knee box, which is cool. It actually does form kind of like this box right here. That's a good question, Kate. I will answer that one in a second. That's a good question. So yeah, you have the knee box. You have the calf. Put that a little bit higher. You have the calf. And then you get down to the ankle. And then the foot. This is my language right there. Like I always put this little like gap between the big toe and like the other toes to kind of show that grouping. So just to always explain like what those symbols are coming from. But yeah, what you'll notice on this leg, so this is meant to be the person's right leg, right? Is you'll always have this axis where it's higher on the outside, lower on the inside for the calf, and then the total opposite on the ankle. Higher on the inside, lower on the outside. And then the little gag is you end up with, you know, this is your calves, this is your ankles, so you have kind of this little angry face. So you always remember the angry face ribbon for that leg. So that's why this is again at an angle. So Kate had a good question. She asked, at what point in understanding bones, like the pursuit of trying to understand bones, do you stop? Is any bone too small to know and understand? That's a really great question, because I feel like some of the only bones that I glaze over, meaning like right now, like, you know, point blank asking me, the ones I still just wouldn't totally know, like from top of my head, would be like tarsal and like carpal, like kind of like wrist bones and like little like feet bones and things like that. Those like really small bones, I think there's like 9 of them in your wrist before it gets into like your phalange. To me, things like that are definitely like really small. Like meaning, you know, even for a lot of us wanting to professionally make art or work professionally, like you would group those wrist bones like this, you know, before you get into your kind of carpal bone, you know, phalange kind of stuff. So, you know, like in your hand, so here's like your hand being formed. You know, in your hand, you have like 9 bones or something, like 7 to 9. I believe, I want to say it's 9 bones here, maybe 7. Shows my, again, like my memory on that one. And I would say like those, again, like that stuff gets really small. The other like idea also would be your skull, because your skull actually has like pieces that are technically like bone, or like they're labeled separately. Your pelvis does, right? Your pelvis has like your iliac crest, your ischium. I would say like once you start to like break up a big unit, like breaking up like the pelvis and stuff like that into those pieces, breaking up the hand bones, those are those kinds of ideas that are really like truly in depth. Like that's the kind of stuff I think if you just really like the body, if you kind of have a knack for science and for terminology and enjoy it, like that's where I think that's super cool to have under your belt. But what I'm probably building towards is for a lot of those bones, you may not see them on the surface. So like a lot of our concern would be bones that have impact on the surface, or of course like big groups of bones, like the rib cage, things like that. But typically in life drawing, you know, like a lot of, again, our concern outside of like very personal stuff that you might like about the body, we really want to know, again, like what's this? Like, you know, like right away when we look at this bone, like our elbow, we want to know, hey, what does that belong to? You know, even like a funny question to ask yourself is, hey, is this bone on my elbow, does it belong to my upper arm or does it belong to my lower arm? Of course, the answer is our lower arm, because that's our ulna. It's actually the same bone that's a piece of your wrist right here, right? Those, I think, are the cool bones to kind of learn more and more, is like stuff that's on the surface. Okay, so there's that leg. We'll do this one real fast. We're getting a little bit towards our time, which again, that'll be a good time. We'll do a little more Q&A if you guys have any questions. In the future, again, with these kinds of sessions, you know, these are kind of specific towards all the content that I've been talking about in the book, but I'm definitely going to do, again, like some more demos, some more workshops. Like there'll definitely be more Zoom. But at this point, what's cool is if you get into the book, or if you're doing some drawing from it, that's even better, because we'll get to whether you want to, you know, talk about it, or if you want to like email me and I'll put it on the screen, you know, we'll get to like put up some of your stuff and kind of discuss that, or like answer some questions you might have. You know, of course, hence the whole book club. The book club is very like, you know, just catch-all name for what I wanted to do with the figure drawing title. But like in the true form of a book club, that's what I think would be cool. So you guys are more than welcome to submit some drawings, you know, bring some stuff in. That way we can talk about your stuff as well. You know, can answer some questions you might have. And then each time that I get on here, I'll definitely do like a demo. You know, like I'll demo, I'll talk about something in particular. You know, and what I'm doing today is I'm kind of summarizing like from chapter 1 what I find to be the most important. Like from chapter 1, out of everything it talks about, I think the mannequin is absolutely the most important part of the book. It's kind of one of the most important parts of the book in general, especially with like Loomis theory and this kind of theory in general, because what might be different depending on your exposure to life drawing is a lot of life drawing is truly observational. It's not necessarily structural. It's not necessarily based on something like this, like a framework. And so like learning this idea, like the structure of the body and a simplification of the body, is the first step towards doing more inventive drawing, doing more structural drawing. In my opinion, of course, truly like doing better life drawing, like doing stuff that actually has more volume. Because if I could distill it down into one word besides structure, it's also behavior. It's like I think you learn a lot about how the body behaves and what's happening beneath the surface when you kind of draw and investigate like this. And of course, in the book, in chapter 1, he talks a little bit about that. There's a lot of stuff on here that I talked about on Patreon that involves like illustration, right? Stuff like, you know, how to draw figures on a plane, how to draw figures in different perspectives, which I say over and over again in those Patreon posts is super important. But for a beginner, that's probably the reason people would look at the book and be like, wow, like, I don't know what's going on here. And that's okay. And that's, if anything, that's totally acceptable, because that stuff is not only challenging, but that's truly more towards illustration versus kind of like pure, you're just going to draw a figure. But yeah, any last thoughts? I'll put this up like on, you know, Patreon, of course, although I've drawn it quite a bit, but I'll definitely put this one. I'll probably put it on Instagram. I'll make sure if you want a copy of this, you're more than welcome to get it. But yeah, any final questions, final thoughts? How you doing, Michelle? Doing good? Cool. Sean, you doing good? Cool, man. Yeah, and then another thing again is for these kinds of meetings, feel free in the future as I announce them more and more, you can submit some questions ahead of time. That way I can answer some of this stuff. These are, in particular, this stuff to me is cool because I like showing or teaching sometimes over the screen. I think it's a bit easier to see and I can kind of format it better. And then truthfully, of course, like Instagram, for some of you guys who watch Instagram Live, is like a little bit crunchy. You know what I mean? Like it's not super clear sometimes to like hear or see things. So but yeah, we'll have some more Zoom. My goal, if you want to keep track of it, and I'll of course write it down online, is basically the third Thursday of every month we'll have a Zoom. So the third Thursday of every month, we'll do a little Zoom meeting. We'll probably break that cap off the Zoom eventually, so we'll do more like an hour. You know, and again, that gives us time to talk about the chapter, do a demo, you know, answer some questions, things like that. But yeah, thanks so much for joining. Thanks for helping me with my first one. Seems like it went pretty well, not too bad, right? And again, I think I'm gonna have a copy of the video, so I'll post that up too if you guys need to review it. And then at all times, ask questions. Please feel free to message me, ask some questions. A lot of you guys have my email, especially through Patreon, because I'm always happy to help, and I'm always happy to, again, discuss this book, because for some of you, if this is your first time looking at the book or doing figure drawing, that's my big goal, is to actually kind of like filter a little bit, kind of help out with it. But yeah, I'll see you guys online, and I'll update you when the next one happens. I'll talk to you soon. See ya. Bye, guys.